I wonder if you ever think about what has made you the person that you are today. Like set aside everything that I've just said to the young people about how God is working, and as of course He is, and changing us. So where you are today perhaps is not where you were before you knew the Lord. And I don't know what stage in your life, or maybe you've not at the stage in your life where you can say that I know the Lord, and I feel the Lord working in my life. Maybe that's not you. But so I wonder then, what has led you to where you are today? What stages have you gone through, and what shapes the people that we are now? Of course, there's the big nature versus nurture debate, isn't there? Is it genetics that shapes the person that you are? Are you a product of your environment? There's some interesting studies on that when it regards twins. So there's definitely a genetic component because they've studied identical twins and found the ones that were separated at birth, and found that in personality type they're very similar, even though they've never grown up in the same home and such like. But they've also noticed things like the interplay between genetics and the environment, where they've identified a particular gene that, subject to stress, subject to maltreatment in childhood, can sort of work with that maltreatment in a really dangerous way, and it produces can produce very aggressive adults and such like. So I think there's definitely both at play. I think that's what the studies seem to suggest, that both play their part in shaping who you are. And so you carry from birth and from your childhood all this baggage that leads to you being labelled in certain ways. Some of it really is genetic, and not much you can really do about that. Some has come about as a result of the way that you've lived, the way that you've been brought up, and all your experiences thereafter. But one thing is true that I think we'll all agree is that whether it is nature or nurture that gives you a particular personality type or a trait or whatever it is, behaviours and habits, it can be very difficult to leave these things behind, these characteristics behind, at least to leave them entirely behind. And it's also difficult that even if they are left behind, and even if God, this promise of new life, does affect change in you, maybe others don't want to let that go either. So that can happen. You can feel that you've changed, but that doesn't mean everyone else is going to agree or recognize it or acknowledge it or praise you for it. So anyway, that we know this. But anyway, some of these things that we carry can be very heavy, this baggage that we carry. But in our series, The Promise of the Cross, we come to the promise of new life. That is, in Jesus' death, and we've spoken about this in previous weeks, but in Jesus' death, there is this paradox where, for us, it means new life. It means rebirth. When He is cruelly crucified and goes to the grave and then rises from it, we are given the possibility of new life. It's a very real thing, and I hope that you're going to see that it's a very real thing in what we explored today, if you've already not convinced of that. And I hope that most of you are convinced of that, because you've probably got your own story to tell of your new life. But how do we define that? What does new life look like? How can we define it? What does it mean? What does it mean for us in reality? What does it look like? Does it mean that our personalities change? Does it mean that we immediately start living differently? Does it mean that all the life choices we made up to the point where we met Jesus, where Jesus took control of our life, where He became the captain of our ship, does it mean that all those choices and all those things we did are now invalid and useless and forgotten and should be? Does it mean that we should distance ourselves from our past altogether and all that we learned and experienced? And another question is, what does it mean to receive the promise of new life then? So we'll explore some of these things, but we can't answer all those questions. I'll leave them as open questions. And so maybe I'll repeat a couple of them. Should we distance ourselves from everything that's gone before? That old life, is all of it to be forgotten? Is all of it useless? Or does God do something with it? That's the question. Do we start immediately living differently? Do our personalities change? All these questions. I'm not going to provide answers to that. I can't necessarily provide answers to all of these, but I think we'll explore it. And I think the best way to do that is by looking at a biblical case study. And the obvious one's Paul. I mean, very obvious, but I think with Paul, it's almost too obvious, Because with Paul, the change is so immediate and so powerful and so stark between the man he was before and the man he becomes. And yet, at the same time, there probably are things that he always was. But the big things change dramatically in his life. So it's very obvious, but it's almost too obvious because it certainly, as I said, I think there's a twofold thing here going on with this new life idea. The idea of us becoming new creations that we sang about, that's very obvious in Paul's life. It might be very obvious in the life of some people that you know, people who were previously drug addicted, alcoholics, in prison, and then they find God works in their heart, changes them, they become a different person altogether. In those lives, it's very obvious that element is at play. New life, new person, new character, new attitudes, from hateful to loving, and all these things are very obvious and evident. But I think there's something else too to this new life, because remember, God does that work in Paul's heart, not so that Paul can just from that point just sort of strut about, saying, look how wonderful I am, I've changed everybody, look how great I am. It's not for that purpose. It's not for glorifying Paul. It's so that he might glorify God. And so therefore there's this other element to this new life, is that this new purpose that you're given. It's not just about you changing as an individual, your personality maybe being altered and God shaping that and shaping, working on you, molding like the way you might with a little clay figure or something. It's not just about that. That's part of it, of course, but there's also this other element where what does God want to do with that new creation? What's that new purpose? What is that new life going to look like beyond or while God's shaping you into a new individual? What's the purpose of that? What if he's, there's that other song, that other hymn, make me an instrument, Lord. I'm a tool in your hand. So if God's got the tool and he's shaping you into the tool, he wants the best tool that you can be. So imagine the way that you see these folks work. I love this program. I can't remember the name of it right now, Forged in Fire. And so these guys are like metal workers, they're blacksmiths, and they're creating weapons and all these sorts of things. But it's amazing to watch their work and how they forge these things and how the strength they give them. So it's like God working on you. He's making you like the best instrument, the best tool that you can be in his hand. But what's the work? What will you be employed for? What will you be used for? That, I think, is another element of new life that we have to consider. I think that if we neglect that, we then almost like the work in you can hang there as a work in itself, but you miss the bigger picture. So Joseph, I think, is an example of this. Let's think this through. Let's have a real good deep dive into Joseph's life and his family in his early years and think about nature, nurture, and all that he goes through, right? So we'll try and rattle through. I don't want to go too fast, but I don't want to go on too long today. Sharon looks doubtful that I'll manage it. But deep dive into Joseph then, right? Because you might say, you might conclude when you look at Joseph's start in life that he didn't stand much of a chance. He's born into a large family of mainly boys, and we'll go into more detail about that in a while. But suffice to say that straight off the bat, this is not going to be an easy environment to grow up in. Anyone who's grown up in a large family can attest to that. I didn't, Sharon did, our children are. But there's going to be sibling rivalry. That can happen in small families too, but when you've got lots of boys or lots of girls, you're going to have sibling rivalry, you're going to have physical fights, you're going to have bullying going on at times, you're going to have personality clashes, you name it, it'll be surely happening. And you can see, as I say that, the exasperation of of having 4 girls. Some of this is personal experience. Joseph's born into that, but he's also born into a family caught up in the middle of controversy. His father, Jacob, falls in love with his cousin, a girl named Rachel. He agrees to work for her father, Laban, who is also Jacob's uncle, of course, for 7 years. The deal is struck, and after 7 years, the wedding day arrives. Now, Laban has 2 daughters. He's got Rachel, that Jacob loves, and he's got Leah. And Leah's the oldest, but Rachel's the one that's caught Jacob's eye. But on the evening of the wedding, Uncle Laban tricks Jacob. Now, there's an irony in that as well, isn't it? Because Jacob himself had previously tricked his brother remembered Esau. So, yeah, there's an interesting twist in that. But he's tricked. Uncle Laban tricks Jacob and sends his eldest daughter Leah to Jacob's tent instead of Rachel. And Jacob spends the wedding night with Leah, and in the morning discovers the trick. Jacob confronts Laban, who agrees to let Jacob have Rachel in exchange for 7 more years of work. That's why he does it, so he can get more work out of Jacob. In the end, he doesn't have to wait 7 years to marry her. He gets her hand within 1 week of that deal being struck. But in total, there's 7 years and another 7 years demanded and due to Uncle Laban. So this is the background to Joseph's start. So that's Jacob, his father. Okay, so within a week, Jacob has 2 young wives, and those 2 wives are sisters. Now we know that Jacob clearly loves Rachel more than he does Leah. Now that is messy, isn't it? That sets the stage for all sorts of bitterness and anger and jealousy. And I would suggest that's not the greatest environment to be born into if you are Joseph or any of the children, actually. But let's go on. It isn't long before Leah gets pregnant. She gets pregnant not once but 4 times. She gives Jacob the 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel is not able at that stage to give Jacob any children. Now that's very difficult for a woman, particularly for a woman in that culture, to be childless. So she takes matters into her own hands, and she gives Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, to have children in her place. So she produces 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah sees this, and so she gives her handmaid, Zilpah, to Jacob to have children for her, and she has another 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Now, after a time, Leah has 3 more children by Jacob: Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter named Dinah. Are you confused yet? I kind of am. I don't expect you to remember all of this, but we're painting the picture of the family that Joseph is coming into. Now, Jacob at this stage has 10 sons and a daughter, but his beloved wife Rachel is still without a child. God hears her pleas for a son, and Joseph's born. And then, of course, later also Benjamin. So he's at Joseph and Benjamin at the tail end of all of this. They're the ones most likely going to be getting pushed around. And we know Joseph ends up in a very horrific way for that happening to him. So, I don't imagine that's an easy situation to be in. And remember, this has come about by trickery, and there will be bitterness about that. And well, we see what happens because... but let's just say, in his early years, it was like a minefield, and it does make you wonder how, in that environment, folks could come out of that unscarred, with their emotions intact in such a situation. It would be very difficult. So you got all those problems in the home. One man with children by 4 women living under the same roof, a recipe for trouble. Add this to the fact that Jacob loves Rachel more. We've said that already. There's that dynamic going on, and you've got plenty of trouble to go around. And then we have this incident where Joseph and his family sort of flee in the middle of the night and make a hasty departure, get out of Laban, Joseph's granddad, Jacob's uncle Laban's house. They flee his house under cover of darkness because effectively Jacob has cleaned out his father-in-law through deception, or at least that's certainly how the grandfather sees it. And we're told that he chases the family. There's arguments. When he catches up with them, he accuses Jacob of stealing his household gods. And I thought, right, I don't want to go on too long, but let's just take a little sort of sideways thing into this household gods thing. It's a little bit interesting because at first you might think, well, what was that? What do you mean by household gods with a small g? What we're talking about here is what are known as teraphim. It's little, actually small, portable, human-shaped figures. Very interesting. I should just use that off the top of my head, think about clay figures. Well, that's what these effectively were. They were figures that people would have in their homes for protection, maybe for fertility purpose. They believed it would help them have children, luck, that sort of thing. So these things were physical possessions. And he's accusing Jacob is stealing these things. It turns out that it's Rachel that's taken him, his own daughter. His own daughter. And so she lies to her father to cover up her theft. So all this is going on. Imagine you being that little boy Joseph in the midst of all of this, all this craziness going on in this power struggle and family feud. Eventually, Jacob and Laban make a covenant to stay away from one another. They can't be together. They don't want to see each other ever again. And Joseph never does see his grandfather ever again. Now, all of that, you think that's a lot. But on top of that, let's just run through some other things that we learn in Genesis about what happens as they're traveling from that place. Word comes that Jacob's brother Esau is coming out with many men to meet the family. He's still annoyed as to what Jacob's done to him. Jacob's afraid of what he might do, and so on. And so he has to bribe him. He has to bribe Esau and all this sort of thing. There's this horrible incident where Joseph's sister, his older sister Dinah, is attacked by a man, and we'll not go into the messiness of that, but it's nasty and it's horrible, and there's all that happening. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, dies. Genesis 35:8 tells us. Rachel, Joseph's mother, dies while giving birth to his little brother Benjamin. Reuben, the oldest brother, commits incest with his father's concubine. What a mess! This is just unbelievable. It's like an episode of, what was that from, Jerry Springer, or one of these crazy sort of panel shows and things. Just absolutely mad stuff going on here. Joseph's brothers are we know to be wicked and self-centered men, and that plays out in a very bad way for Joseph. Jacob, there's a truth that he's a passive father who kind of lets his children away with too much, and that doesn't end so well. Jacob is guilty of favoritism, or at least that's how it's perceived by the other children, that he loves Joseph more. Maybe I think that's probably true. And so then you've got all that happening. Joseph, think about that, losing his mother at a young age, and uprooted, and family fights, and all this sort of stuff going on. And that's the environment. So if we talk about your environment shaping you, wow, this boy is been through a lot already. And that's before the main story that we think of, when his brothers attack him and steal his coat and all this sort of stuff that goes on. So this all matters to stand as a testament to what God's promise of new life looks like in reality, because many people in this room can look back at our own upbringing maybe and see many problems. No family is perfect, and hearing what Joseph faced might well have dredged up bad memories of your own past, like the losses that he suffered, and some of the things that he went through might be very similar to things that you went through in your childhood. But in most families, now there are some horrendous families that there's nothing redeemable, but in most families there are negative things, but there's also something positive too. So let's not lose sight of that, and maybe think of how God might have been working even in those early days before Joseph knew anything really of God's hand in his life. And I think we can all, those of us who know the Lord Jesus Christ, can all look back. There were difficult days in our past. There were tough things to deal with. But I think we can all tell stories too of people that were in the family, maybe a grandmother, maybe an auntie, maybe one of your parents, whatever, who had a real influence in you and brought the name of Jesus maybe into your life, and just brought a lot of positivity and light and good things. And maybe that new life that God has given you, maybe that began earlier than you think sometimes. Some might say from before we were even born, God's got his hand on us and working on us. And so the foundations of a new life are being laid long before Joseph recognizes it as that. What are the things that shape him? Well, we know that Jacob has this encounter with God that's talked about in Genesis 32, where he kind of has this wrestling with God, in a sense. When he catches up with his family, he's limping on his leg, and he tells them that he's a new name. He's no longer the Jacob, the trickster, the deceiver, the heel grabber, but he is Israel, which means, Prince with God is one way of putting it. He's a new name, he's a new walk. He recognizes that something's happened in that encounter with God, and Jacob, Joseph's father, has the beginning of a new life. And surely that change in Jacob, we don't know how that looked, but there must have been something. But even the story must have impressed itself upon young Joseph. We're also told that Jacob demands that they do away with their false gods when he calls the family together at one point, Genesis 35. And Jacob builds an altar to the Lord, and he says that, it's almost like from this point on we're going to get serious about God, We're going to leave these false gods behind. And so that must have impressed itself upon Joseph too, and he must not, and this was happening at Bethel, and those things he heard at Bethel and those things he learned at Bethel when that was happening. Again, surely he never forgot those things. They must have been a positive factor in his childhood. And then also, as his family journeyed, they are clearly protected by God, and they realize that. They're surrounded on that journey by warlike tribes, but they're not attacked, and they're kept safe. And surely that made an impression on Joseph, that God had his hand on his life. You'd like to think that already that sense of a new life and what God can do was starting to ferment and starting to grow in Joseph's mind. So thank God for those times that we can look back on in our lives where the Lord was clearly moving, the people he put in our path. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a friend, a neighbor, and despite of the difficulties you maybe had to live with, and maybe much of your childhood when you look back was maybe some of it was quite dark, but there was moments of light, moments of clarity, and we can give thanks for those things. It just does, as an aside, it does remind us of the importance of, the promise that we make to sort of nurture these young people in our church and in our schools and all that, just bringing a bit of the light of Jesus into their experience. We can't really underestimate how important that is. Anyway, God works hard to deliver on his promises, and he's promised you new life. And even after a challenging childhood, Joseph, with all the horror of what his brothers do to him, that's abuse really what they do to him, beating him up, bullying him, throwing him in a pit. Almost in some ways, we get fixated on this quote, and I know it's been turned into a musical and it's a fantastic thing and all that, but I think sometimes we forget this is an absolutely abusive and horrific event. These brothers ganging up on him, bullying him, throwing him in a pit, and then we're told that they eat a meal, cruelly sort of eat a meal while he's starving, while getting hungry down in the pit, and then eventually sell him and into slavery. It's just absolutely horrific, the whole thing. So often the story, sometimes I think we kind of pretty it up a little bit or downplay it a little bit, but it's just absolutely terrible. It's a violent and abusive story. And Joseph's life gets even more messy once he's sold into slavery. But again there, there's good things, and again there, God has his hand in his life, and eventually the plan that God has for him begins to emerge, and we'll come to that ending in a wee moment. But looking at Joseph from the outside, considering all of his problems, considering the dysfunction of his home, it would have been very easy to write him off, wouldn't it? We say that boy will not amount to anything. And maybe you were told that. Maybe you were told that by someone here past, you're not amount to anything, you're not come to anything, almost writing you off. That can happen. But God takes his life and turns him into one of the greatest men of the Bible, a real example for us to look up to. And of course, that's the power of grace. That's the power of God. And that gives me hope. It gives me hope as a parent, because I know that I make mistakes raising my kids. I know there's things that I do that have I could be a bit of a softie, like Jacob. I can let them away with things that they shouldn't, and Mum has to step in. And things, that's one example. And I know that. I hold my hands up. I struggle with that side of things. So it gives me hope as a parent that even with the mistakes I make, and even in the situation that they grew up in with all these rival sisters to deal with and whatnot. It gives me hope that God might have his hand on them and might be laying the foundations for a new life that they might make. And I do really hope that they discover that and that they themselves can name the Lord as their Saviour and come and declare their faith at one point too. I really pray and hope that happens. But it's a comfort to know that even in the ways that we mess up, that God can almost use some of that weakness and some of those failures and build from that and sort of use those kids as a tool in his hand in spite of me in some ways. It gives me hope as a minister too. It gives me hope as a minister when you look around and you see the young people and the world they're growing up in. That was a question on our panel. Is it tough to be a young person today? It was probably always tough to be a young person for various reasons, but there are added elements, social media, and other messiness that makes it really quite challenging for young people today. But it gives me hope hearing this story of Joseph, all that stuff that was happening to him, and who knows what's going on in the lives of many of the children that we encounter through the work of the church. But just to know that God might have his hand on these young ones, and that baggage that they might carry out of childhood, as we all do, that eventually he might give them a sense of having a new life and a new hope. That's really encouraging to me. I hope it's encouraging to you too. Because we're up against it, and they're up against it. We're all up against it on many fronts from the moment you're born. I said that before, original sin, the baggage of our upbringing, and the scars of trying to make our way through the world, given where 1 and 2 leaves us. Original sin and the baggage of our childhood doesn't really equip us well for some of the things that we encounter in life. In fact, it leaves us really vulnerable and really weak, and we get hurt and we get damaged further, and this is how it goes. But even with all of that said, in the cross of Christ, the work of giving new life to the likes of Joseph or Moses or Paul or Zacchaeus, that same promise of new life that God has always held out and offered to his people is there for us too. And I hope you're encouraged by that today in whatever you're facing. And I hope it maybe gives you encouragement to continue praying for a loved one or a friend who is really going through it at the moment and doesn't have a sense of new life, just has a sense that the life that they have is going nowhere. Well, keep praying for them, and maybe speak to them of the likes of Joseph, who came out of a terrible beginning but received blessing and new life. Let me just say finally, sometimes people have the idea that when we talk about, I've got a new life as a Christian, I'm born again, that's another one that triggers people. It triggers them to say, all they're talking about is that they're holier than us, that they've changed, that they think they're perfect. That's what people have an impression of us as Christians. We speak of new life, we speak of being born again, and they think, they think they're better than us. They think they're perfect. And they think that we live lives that are very boring, very judgmental. They think that we live lives that are very much full of rules and prohibitions and puritanical lives. And do you know what? Maybe there's some truth in that. But maybe that's not a bad thing. If it protects you from straying, from messing up, from damaging others, from damaging yourself, that's maybe not a bad thing that these things that is true to an extent. But it's not wholly true. It's not wholly true. And that's why I think the danger of just focusing on that first element of new life, new creation, is you talk about how you've changed. And that's a good thing. That's a great testimony. But people hear that and they think, well, what's this person saying to me? They're saying that they're better than me now or something like that. So I think that's why we need the second element, this idea that, it's not only about God cutting some things out of our lives, taking things away, removing things, but also he gives us new qualities. He gives us new perspectives. He opens up new doors for us. I think if we frame it like that for people, they might understand better that this is not a life of restriction. This is not a life of being compressed or being restricted, and it's not a boring life at all. It's a life filled with joy. It's a life filled with love. It's a life filled with light. And I think we need to let people know that. And you can see that through Joseph's experience. At the end, he's able to say, all these things that were done by you, boys, brothers, God's had a plan to turn that for good, and he did. He did in the end. It ends all right in the end because God has his hand in it. And Joseph can look at it that way, and he can leave that baggage in the past. He can let it go. He can let it go, and he can say, look, this is what God's done. Isn't it amazing? So let's all celebrate it together. I think that's a good perspective to give people, because I think they get the wrong idea about what it is to be born again, to have new life. It's an amazing thing. It doesn't feel like a hardship. It's an incredible thing to know God's promise of new life. I'm not saying life, of course, as a Christian is easy, but surely you'd agree it's infinitely better than the life that you knew before, the life before Jesus. The life after is infinitely better. Not easy, but infinitely better. And the promise of new life is not just that God works in our hearts, he does, and he grows the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, he does, but it's not just that. He doesn't do that so that we can walk around reflecting on how holy we now are. He does it because, like Joseph, he has a plan for you, and he has a purpose for you. And God is going to use you, the new you, in the building of his kingdom. And I hope that word, that thought is an encouragement to you. And remember all the other promises of God's strength, of God's deliverance. These are all true also. So in that new life, you're blessed in so many other ways. Despite all the hardships, despite all the obstacles you face, despite the baggage you carry, despite the scars that you bear, the Lord has a life for you yet. And it's never too late to receive that. And it's never too soon to receive that, of course, either. But at the right time, he will gift you new life, and he'll make you aware of it, and he will give you the joy of knowing it, and he'll enable you to see things differently, maybe even see your past differently, and he'll begin to equip you and fit you for the purposes of this new life. So don't be afraid today, but embrace the promise of new life. Embrace this new beginning that God has started in you. Amen.